I guess, most people tuning in will probably already know, but perhaps it's best to start with a reminder of what the direct program is, because I hear clients say, oh, the direct program's new, right? There's little experience. And of course, that's not true, right? So perhaps, you have an overview of what the direct of EB-5 and what's direct and what's not direct.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you phrased that question in that way, because a lot of people see the direct program as, kind of this upstart thing that's happening in the industry, when in fact it was the original kind of iteration of EB-5. It came about in 1990. And for the first few years of the existence of EB-5, it was the only route. And then frankly, even after the regional center program came about in the early 1990s, the direct program for a period of time continued to be the more prevalent of the two iterations of the program. Huge differences between it though. Number one, the direct program is permanent law, as where the regional center program was a pilot program that required reauthorization from time to time. And as everybody knows now, the program has lapsed. It's been lapsed since June, and now we're waiting for reauthorization for it to come back. The direct program is still available. There are still options available for the direct program.
So Matt, a question occurs to me. You're sitting there with the CMB regional center sign. If direct's been around a long time, some of the regional centers are getting into direct now, but why traditionally have regional centers not been in the direct space? And, why has it not been marketed so heavily?
For a number of reasons. And, the biggest of which that I would tell you is that the direct program has some, let's just say, or a better way to phrase it is the regional center program has some significant benefits to the investors. The biggest one being the ability for the regional centers to use economic models to count job creation, so they can rely upon indirect and induced job creation. The direct program actually requires that the new commercial enterprise create permanent direct jobs. So these are real individual people on site working that are directly employed by that new commercial enterprise or a wholly owned subsidiary of that new commercial enterprise. Right. And so the regional center program allows you to aggregate EB-5 funding with other funding sources. And you're looking at the overall construction aspects of the project and all the monies spent on construction, and then taking those numbers and putting it into an economic modeling tool that allows you to forecast job creation. And then the proof of that job creation really just becomes the final outputs, or what was actually spent on the project. You can do an accounting of all of those expenditures, and you put that into the model, create a new job creation study, and submit that to the USCIS for proof of your job creation. Whereas the direct program is actually going to require that the business provide I-9s, W-2s, and citizenship forms that support that the actual jobs were created and that they lasted for 2 years.
Right, I get that, but also just to be truthful, right? It's because of the way that jobs are calculated in regional center EB-5, there's more big money in a regional center. Why? Because if you have a construction project, you're going to have far more jobs and then far more investors based on a regional center model than is possible with direct. So it seems to me that some of the reason that regional centers been promoted are all of the things you say, but also it's just not commercially viable to fly big teams of people halfway around the world to market for 6 people in a project.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The direct program is very appealing to individual entrepreneurs, people who want to come over and establish their own business, but they may be the sole investor or the sole EB-5 investor in that business in a lot of cases. And to scale the direct program the same way that you would scale a regional center program, whereby you would have a third party that is building the project and developing the investment opportunity for the investors, it's much more difficult to get that scale or build that scale with the direct program as opposed to the regional center program. And so that's, you hit the nail on the head. The opportunity for the regional centers has not always been there, because regional centers are speaking directly for CMB, we're a large operation. We have 50 employees. We have investor relations managers who speak many different languages. We have people with our sister companies stationed around the globe that can work with investors. And so when we put out offerings, we want certain scalability to those offerings that allow us to go out and market to a broader number of investors, as opposed to maybe 2 or 3 investors at a time.
Right.
Might be a better fit for the.
I mean, part of, I think, what we're trying to look at here is for investors tuning in, what are the issues they need to look at with direct EB-5? So we'll come back to that. And then it seems to me that because CMB currently isn't offering a direct, you're in a good place to be sort of neutral and to talk about some of the things that we need to talk about. But from an investor perspective, right, I've always thought that a regional center program is not inherently better than a direct program, or vice versa, because you and I both know there are some pretty terrible regional center projects out there, right? Where you'd rather probably personally be in some of the direct. On the other hand, right, there are some really awful direct projects too, where you don't get the benefit of the job calculations and things. So in terms of looking at direct, it seems to me that this job thing is quite important, because with a regional center case, right, if you're using that mathematical calculations, then things are reasonably certain when you get to the I-526 adjudication. If you're on the direct model, then really that business has got to be operationally viable going past the I-526 adjudication, because they have to be real jobs that are really there. It's not a matter of saying, I've spent enough money in the right way, therefore we're done. Those jobs really have to exist or have to be created within that 2-year window, right?
That's right. One simple way to say it is that the direct program traditionally has a different risk appetite, or attracts investors with a different risk appetite than the regional center program does, for a lot of different reasons. The job creation being, I think, the biggest one of them, because at the end of the day, investors invest in an EB-5 project not to get rich or to make a high rate of return. They make that investment for a green card, and anything that can come in conflict with that pursuit of a green card is generally unpalatable for EB-5 investors. And so you spoke to something that we talk about all the time with our regional center projects. There are ways in which you can be successful, and there are ways in which you can fail. And we get this question a lot. What happens if the project gets built, but the operations go south? Well, in a regional center program, if it's structured conservatively, and if the project is built, the job creation is probably going to be there, and the EB-5 investors are going to get their jobs. In a direct model, that's not the case. The project has to get built. It does have to be able to hire those employees and then maintain those positions for at least 2 years.
That's right. And it's not just getting built, right? Because if you build the project, let's say in year +1 from the green card adjudication, then you've got to maintain, there's got to be jobs maintained for the 2-year window.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got to maintain those jobs. And so, in years past, we've had questions from investors that say, why wouldn't I just do the direct program? It's not dependent on reauthorization. There's different advantages. Well, one of the biggest reasons being is because once you get into that operations phase, there's a whole new level of risk that opens up for the EB-5 investor. And we'll often tell investors that when you're talking about $500,000, the likelihood that they're going to be able to create and sustain those 10 jobs for just that $500,000 investment is not very good. That $500,000 doesn't go as far as it did in 1990 when the program originally came out. So a lot of people,
I know your team at CMB does a lot of due diligence on projects, right? So if you, for whatever reason, had personally decided to invest in a direct project right now, and you were thinking about what do I need to look for in terms of making sure that those jobs are going to be there, what things would you look for in a direct project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here, the reason why it's a great question is because CMB is actively looking for opportunities in the direct program. That's one thing I want to mention. We are actively looking at opportunities, but the reality is that we want to structure opportunities that can be as safe and conservative, or as close as possible to our regional center projects. Different things that will require different risk appetite, namely the investor being a true equity investor in those projects, as opposed to a lender, which is the model that we use for our regional center projects. But understand that when we're looking at these projects, job creation becomes key. And so what we're really looking at is the business model. We're looking at the staffing models associated to, well, let's just say it's a restaurant. We want to know how many employees it's going to staff, how many it has to maintain full time. We're going to want to know the location in which it's operating, how likely it is that they're going to be able to sustain business, how likely it is that they're going to be able to maintain those levels of employment. And then you're really having to kind of stress test those staffing models and stress test the job creation that's going to be there, in that if there's another shutdown for COVID, if restaurants have to limit occupancy, are they going to lay off staff? Are you going to be able to maintain those positions? So all of those things matter. So there's a lot of due diligence that's going to go into that. Because again, it's not just spending money and putting it into a spending model. It's looking at how many employees are actually going to be staffed there. Are they full-time employees? Program requires that they be full-time employees. A lot of these restaurants, a lot of these opportunities that we've seen in the market, it's a lot of part-time staff, and it gets a little bit challenging as far as how you can look at
you can aggregate part-time employees, but we know USCIS don't like that. So you can do it, it's allowed, but the practicalities of doing it can be challenging. I think you're right.
Yeah. And it's a different burden of information that the investor is going to have to provide to the USCIS. And so it's something that the investor should always be really weary of. The more information you're providing to the USCIS, the more opportunity there is for the USCIS to challenge it. That's something that's got to be going on.
I guess what you're saying is one of the things that you would look for is a very detailed staffing plan that makes sense.
Very much so. A very detailed staffing plan. You're really going to want to understand the market in which that project is going to be located. Is it going to be a viable business? Because then you get into the other sides of the it's not a collateralized loan the way a regional center project might be. You are a pure equity investor. So if that business enterprise is failing, you're going to have to make a capital call, or you may have to make a capital call. You know, there are challenges that that can exist in that model.
Sorry, Matt. I know some of our investors from India won't understand what a capital call is. Can you just explain?
Sure. Yeah. So if you're an equity investor and the business is failing, it's not operating at a level which will allow it to offset its costs, you may be running at a deficit. You know, you may be having to pay employees, but you're not generating the revenue to offset what you're having to pay those employees. So you may have to put more money into the business enterprise to maintain a staff and kind of make it through a slow period. Or you may have to lay off staff. Obviously, if you have to lay off staff, then you're putting your green card, pursuit in jeopardy.
So we've been doing direct cases for many years. And one of the things you mentioned raises an issue is, in our experience, when USCIS look at staffing on direct, it's not just a question of, do you have the employees? It's a question of, are they needed? So the question comes up, you just sort of mentioned, you might have to put in capital to keep the business afloat. Well, USCIS are very much quite often going to look and say, not only do you have the employees, but do we think they're actually needed for the business?
Yeah. You know, that's something that a lot of people don't know that they do at the regional center program as well. But as it pertains to the direct program, you can't just have a bunch of people standing around and then tell USCIS, hey, look, we met our obligation to create and maintain those 10 jobs. Well, all the while the investor was offsetting it with just, additional cash flow to make sure that those jobs could be created and those employees paid. They want to know that were those jobs actually needed for that restaurant. In the regional center program, it's a little different. They actually look at the costs that you're providing them and they say, hey, are they overinflating these costs? Because overinflating means that you could be pumping up the job creation study to say that more jobs are going to be created than what are actually going to be created. So those are parallels between the two programs, and the USCIS pays close attention to those things.
So I think what you're saying, another thing to look at too, right, is you would feel more comfortable with a job margin even in direct. So legally the requirement's 10, But you also see some jobs, we've seen it, I think, in direct. Sometimes some of those jobs may get disallowed for various reasons, even a direct model. So detailed staffing plan, but also, I've seen a number of the direct projects in the market right now that have exactly 10 jobs per investor with sort of 4 or 5 investors. And to me, that's a bit of a red flag. What do you think?
I completely agree. That's incredibly risky. And for all the reasons we just mentioned, whether the USCIS is going to challenge certain jobs as necessary, or whether or not you're going to have issues with your business operation that would prevent you from maintaining that employment. It's different if you have an excess of 4 or 5 jobs and the USCIS might discount 1 or 2 of those jobs. Well, you're still covered. Or if you have to lay off an employee, you're still covered. But to be in a position where you're trying to thread a needle and create 10 jobs and only projected to create 10 jobs, that's very difficult.
Right. And as we just talked about, right, the USCIS may say, okay, you got 14 jobs, but we don't think you need 2 of them. The business doesn't require 2 of them. And then you've got a little bit of a safety margin, as you say. So, one of the things I think I would look for if I was an investor is I would want a little bit of cushion. And I certainly would want to understand the staffing plan because it's going to get drilled. We know that USCIS have models, right, for different industry. I mean, you may have more insight on that than I do, but I know for a fact that their office there in Washington, D.C. has models for different industries and sort of what staffing versus revenue should look like.
Right. And we'd expect that they're going to utilize those and they're going to look at these, especially right now. And one of the things that a lot of investors who are considering making a direct investment need to realize is that the market's been flooded, but it hasn't necessarily been flooded by quality opportunities. I think we saw a lot of regional centers rush to adjust their projects to a direct model, or people run out and start to promote a project as if it's a regional center project that will be counted under the direct program. It's not easy to restructure a regional center project and make it a direct project. So we expect that there's going to be a lot of failed projects out there, not even necessarily from a construction completion or an operation standpoint, but purely from a structuring standpoint. We think that there's going to be a lot of people that just didn't know what they were doing and rushed to take advantage of an increase in demand for the direct program. So we think that the USCIS is going to pay very close attention to some of these and end up becoming huge issues in the market.
Right, because you and I both, it's not you and I, everybody in the industry knows that USCIS hate the way that this got back to $500,000, right? So I think anyone that's trying to come through at $500,000, it's probably not true to say they're automatically going to have a problem, but I think they're going to get a high degree of scrutiny.
Yeah, I would expect that. I really would, because right now I think there's probably people at the USCIS that are legacy employees that were part of the creation of those regulations that feel particularly wronged by the idea that those regulations were overturned on, let's all be honest, a technicality. And there are probably people that are, whether it's by pure intention or not, putting a little extra effort into the review of some of these projects, and things that may have otherwise, gone under the radar might be subject to additional scrutiny. And so investors need to really take that into consideration. One of the things that I've always said about our regional center projects is that not all regional centers are created equal, not all projects are created equal. So you really have to pay attention to the sponsor for the project. You have to pay attention to the regional center, who's behind that regional center, how they're structuring it, what experience they have, and understand right now with the direct program, there are a lot of people with no experience at all rushing direct projects to the market. You should also understand that the issuer is generally not the regional center. So if you've seen a regional center that does have a track record, that does have a history of success, and they're going out there and actively promoting a direct project, in a lot of these cases, they're not the actual issuer. You're not investing into a project that regional center controls. You're investing into a project that some new business entity or some franchisor is controlling. And so you need to understand that the actions that the regional center, the group of people that had otherwise had control and had more say in how these projects would work, they may not have that same level of say. They may just be working to simply promote and raise investors for a project that they really have no stake in.
I think that raises a really important topic in this direct context, because if you look at major regional centers like yours, and there are some other good, very good ones in the market too, you have, the really big guys have teams of lawyers from very reputable law firms, not only immigration firms, but corporate law firms too. So for example, Matt, you just mentioned the word franchise, right? To me, that's a little bit of a red flag, because there's a lot of people promoting direct EB-5 and other things in a franchise context, and they hire an immigration lawyer, do their bits. But a franchise agreement can be horrible. You talked about capital calls. There are a number of investors out there who are going to find that the franchise agreement that they've signed up to puts them on the hook for making additional capital contributions to the business under certain circumstances, and nobody told them. Why? Because they've got an immigration lawyer that's looking at whether it qualifies for direct or whatever it might be. There's no independent lawyer reading the franchise agreement and telling them that they're signing up to get fresh demands for capital in some of those franchise deals at frequent intervals.
Right. Yeah, and that can be a huge issue. I mean, people that were keen on the regional center program, that were reviewing opportunities that just didn't make it in before June 30th, that are now looking for those and seeing these projects under the direct program as a parallel to those, or maybe as an attractive option. They need to be aware of all of those types of things. There are a lot of different footfalls when it comes to the direct program, simply based on the way in which these have to be structured. They're more closely aligned and exposed by the entity that's actually operating the business. They're not necessarily what we used to call a quasi, passive investor, not a purely passive investor, but a somewhat passive investor in the regional center program. They're in a lot of these direct offerings, they're a direct investor, a common equity holder or a preferred equity holder in a project, and they're along for the ride. And that's
it seems to me, if you have a well-known, reputable regional center, you can debate, and we've talked before about, whether investors should be doing non-immigration legal due diligence. That's a whole topic. But at least if you've got a big reputable regional center in place, someone's probably looking at those issues, right? Common issue of you're doing a construction project, you do a real estate construction. Things that come to mind are there have been projects in the market where they don't even have the necessary construction permits. So that is a purely legal issue. If you are looking at a regional center project, chances are regional centers council have looked at those issues. If you take out the regional center with their responsibility to investors, it gets doubly worse, because there's no one looking at that on behalf of the investor. Leases, right? You use leases in your project, and we've talked about it. They can say, well, this is backed by a lease, but if the lease is questionable as to its enforceability, it's not really worth very much. On the other hand, right, if a real estate lawyer has read the lease and takes an opinion that this is solid, that's a very helpful thing to do. So I'm just listening to what you're saying and making the point that when you look at these direct projects, you need to understand not only the immigration risk, but you need to understand other legal risks that you might be getting into as an investor.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we think about it from our perspective also. We have a motto. Our simple motto is that if our investors have success, we'll have success. Well, in the regional center program, we're a fiduciary for those investors. And so we set up our projects to create success for our investors, knowing that if everything goes right, we're going to make money, they're going to get their green card, and everyone's going to be happy in the outcome. But in the direct projects, we don't have as much control in how the project progresses. In our regional center programs, we are a fiduciary for the investors. We can enforce the terms and conditions of the loan agreement. In the direct model, there's not a structure like that. There's not a situation in which a third party will, enforce terms and conditions of an agreement on behalf of those investors, at least that I've seen. And so when I mentioned earlier that we're actually looking at direct opportunities, biggest reason being is because there is this lapse, and we're all confident that the program will be back. But we know that there's interest, there's demand. And if we're ever going to do a direct project in EB-5, we're going to do everything we can to structure it as similarly as possible to the regional center offerings that we do. So we do create some structures that allow us to serve as a fiduciary in certain instances for our investors. We do give our investors a little bit more clarity in what it is involved in up front. We don't just purely serve as an aggregator of investors for another entity and then step aside when the business operations begin.
I think
there are a lot of things that we're taking into consideration.
I think you're raising, again, like a really good point. This is coming here across here is, who is going to monitor stuff? One thing, right? One thing is to understand what the liabilities and risks might be going in. That's due diligence. But once you're in the project, who's going to monitor compliance? I mean, there's two issues to me that spring to mind. First is, you better think about those jobs in I-829 and maintaining the right records so you're ready to file. If you've got an inexperienced operator who hasn't, in terms of EB-5, who's going to be responsible? How's that going to get done? And there's no one looking over their shoulder. Second point being, these commercial agreements, right? I've just seen so many nightmares with franchise agreements. I don't want to be quoted as saying I think franchise is all bad, because I don't think that. But I absolutely think that you can get yourself on the hook for all kinds of things. There can be requirements to maintain certain capital ratios, operating ratios. So someone better monitor what's going on with that business and what your liability may or may not be, right? You mentioned construction projects. If we're in a construction project, right, who's going to make sure that the developer's not in default? What are you going to do if you're an equity holder? What are your rights if the developer defaults? If there's some kind of default, who's going to do it? What's going to happen? Seems to me those issues are an interesting thing.
They are, and an experienced regional center, and I'll just tell you from my perspective, with our team, the team that we have in place, we feel like if we can structure the right opportunity, we can still provide those things for our investors. We haven't seen those opportunities out on the market right now in the direct world. It's much more complicated. But for an EB-5 investor, they're going to want to know all of these things that are happening over the course of time. And if you're going into a direct project that's just being promoted by someone who's been involved in the EB-5 industry, but with an entity, a new business entity or an operator or a franchisor that is not familiar with EB-5 and the types of information that the investors are going to need and how their filing templates are going to need to be created and so on and so forth, that level of communication is going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for the investors and their attorneys to be able to kind of navigate the challenges that EB-5 can bring if there's not a good marriage there between the people who have control, the people who are involved in the project, and the investors themselves.
So I guess the point really is, if you're looking at one of these projects, right, let's assume you want to do direct, whether it's good or bad, then what are you looking for? And what you're looking for is real answers as to who's going to do this for you, right?
That's the most simple way to say it. Who's going to do it? Who's going to be involved? Who's going to provide me the information? Who is my primary point of contact? How am I going to get the information that I need to be successful? And then there's one more issue that a lot of people have not talked about. And this might get a little complicated for this forum here, but there's also challenges that don't escape the direct program, such as redeployment, for instance. In a traditional EB-5 regional center project.
Can you just explain what redeployment is quickly in case people don't?
Yeah, redeployment is a requirement that USCIS has created that requires that the EB-5 investor keep their capital at risk and deployed into a new business entity throughout the duration of their 2-year sustainment period. So after you've gotten your initial petition approval, you've gotten your conditional green card, you have a 2-year period where your money has to continue to remain outstanding. And so the reason why I bring this up is because some countries like China are very backlogged, and they'll almost always need to redeploy capital. But even countries that aren't, backlogged may end up needing redeployment because, the entity that controls the business might decide to pay out all of its equity investors early. They may decide that they want to sell the business. They may not be actually, it might be a situation where they're not operating successfully and they just want to get out of the business and they sell it. Well, if you get your capital returned to you, you actually have to reinvest that capital. And this is something that, from a regional center perspective, the regional centers have handled. They've come up with plans and models as to how they will redeploy so that it takes the guesswork out of it for the EB-5 investors. But this is a challenge that could present that could be presented to individual EB-5 investors who invest into a direct project. And it's something that a lot of people need to consider. If there's an issue like that, or if there's a major change in immigration law, who's looking out for the EB-5 investors to make sure that those issues are navigated? And so, like I said, maybe a little bit complicated for this forum. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Mark or myself. But the point is that there are myriad challenges that can be presented in EB-5 in general. And I think some of those issues are heightened in the direct program. So anyone looking at investing into a direct project, they need to be really careful on what they're getting into. They really need to understand the parties involved, and they need to leave no stone unturned in completing due diligence. Right now, it shouldn't just be a race to get in at 500,000 into anything you can find. You should still be considering, hey, am I going to make this investment and get my green card and get my money back? Those are the most important things that an investor should be looking at.
I mean, you structure a lot of projects. How easy is it to structure a direct project so effectively, indirectly, you have collateral against your investment? I mean, we understanding in the regional center, you don't directly have indirectly you have some collateral, right? In many projects, not in many projects. How easy is that to do in a direct project, and what should you look for?
Yeah, it's not easy to do it in a direct program or into a direct project. And here's why. The investors have
take a step back, Matt. I've used the word collateral, and I've probably lost some people because they don't use that word in some countries.
Yeah, what Mark's getting at is, recourse against whoever is actually using your money. How do you come up with some way to claw into that entity or that person that's actually using your money to build this project or to, conduct operations for a project? In a loan, you might collateralize it with a, personal guarantee from the developer. And you can enforce that if there's a default, meaning they don't pay it on time or they stop paying interest or some technical issue that they don't comply with. But understand that in the direct project, you're investing into an entity that you're going to co-own with the developer or the restaurant owner, restaurant operator. So there is no collateralization per se that can exist. The other reason for that is that because you're directly invested with that other entity, any repayment obligation that you put on that entity or any recourse that you make would be directly to you personally. This becomes an issue with EB-5 because the program requires that the individual investor put their money fully at risk, and they can't personally have any recourse obligation or right to redeem their investment or action that they can take that would allow them to redeem their investment in part or in full from the entity that's using that capital. So there's really not a way to collateralize that. Once you make that investment, like I said, you're a co-owner, so to speak. You're in for the good, you're in for the bad.
Right. So again, if you're looking at a project, it's very definitely questions to ask. How is what level of protection is there for my capital? Because, one thing about a big regional center project, it's quite well structured. And even, looking at guarantees, you have a guarantee from, a major developer. A lot of them are public companies. You can see what you're dealing with. With a lot of these smaller deals, you're not. You're dealing with some guy who happens to own 20, name it, Subway restaurants and wants 2 more, and you're going to be part of one. Well, if he's offering a guarantee, before you get to the question that you're talking about, of whether it's proper in an EB-5 context, you better have access to his balance sheet, right? Otherwise, it's a completely meaningless piece of paper.
That's exactly right. And I guess that's always the case in business, right? You really need to understand the entities that are using your capital, the entities that are saying that they can do what they need to do. What's their ability to put in additional capital if the project starts to go bad? Because it could be left all on you. That's something that you really need to take into consideration. Are you going to let your $500,000 disappear as well as your job creation pursuit, or are you going to put in additional capital if it's required? If you're working with a developer that has deeper pockets, if you are confident in their balance sheet and their ability to infuse additional capital, that might give you some extra confidence that if the project starts to go through a tough patch, that it can make it through it. But then you also have to look at, if that developer or that co-owner, that partner of yours in that situation is going to invest additional capital, is that going to dilute your interest in the ownership of the business? And is that ultimately going to make it harder for you to get your $500,000 back sometime into the future? And we haven't even really touched on one of the biggest issues. When CMB came about back in the 1990s, Pat Hogan, founder of CMB, created the EB-5 loan model all the way back in 1997 with his first project that he took on. And by a loan model, what we mean is with the regional center program, investors are allowed to invest into an entity that isn't directly owning the project. And what that means is that that entity can pool capital and then make a loan or make an investment. And traditionally in EB-5, those were always equity investments. And just like the direct program is an equity investment. The reason why the loan program became so popular is because with equity investments, there's not a great vision on an exit strategy. A lot of times investors are left to sell their interest or their ownership interest in that new business entity. If the business is doing well, they might be able to make more than their $500,000 back. But if it's not doing well, they may not ever be able to recover their capital, or they may just have to stay in for, years and years and years, not being able to actually get their capital back. Investors wanted a clear exit strategy. And by creating a loan with a maturity date and an exit strategy as how to pay off or refinance that loan from the borrower, it created that perfect, clear exit strategy where investors could know, hey, at the end of this 6 years, here's what's supposed to happen. If all these things happen, loan will get repaid. I'll be able to get my money back. Well, understand in the direct project, that loan isn't there. That loan is not, you cannot use that loan structure. You have to be directly invested into the entity that owns and operates the business. So you are an equity investor. You are going to be subject to some event that would allow you to sell your shares in order to recover your capital. So you're, like I said, you're in for the good, you're in for the bad. It might be that the developer is projecting some event 5 years down the road. It might be 6 years down the road. But if that event comes, if that date comes and goes, understand there's no maturity date, there's no default date, there's no situation in which the borrower is going to be obligated to take you out at that point in time, with any real teeth in it. So it's something that investors need to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think when you structure these things, it strikes me there's not a lot of knowledge in them. So in the first few months of this, I saw a number of places that, as you know, in direct, you can have as long as you have subsidiaries that are 100% owned, that's allowed in a direct context. There was a number of months where people were not sort of acknowledging that opportunity, if you will, right? And that might enable you to do things, but you have to be really careful of the issue that you just stated, which is a very technical one, which is as soon as you start to go too much down the line of protecting people's capital, you begin to bump into redemption problems. And that's a killer for your green card. That's the kiss of death. That's DOA for your green card.
It really is. And so you have to be in a situation where your money is truly at risk. You cannot just claw it back. And anything that starts to blur those lines, USCIS is likely to challenge.
So again, lots of we have a lot of direct investors that get through things and they get, I think what's changed sense to me in the market is direct was always being used by, well, what I think we saw was individuals looking to expand their own business into America, right? Or perhaps a family group. And you might have a cousin investing with a family and they're expanding their, linen manufacturing business into America or something. It seems to me what the recent big trend is, for obvious reasons, is for people to try and duplicate the regional center program, right? Which is, I don't know how many filings there are in this context. It's going to be very hard to see, but I suspect that, a lot of people are doing what you mentioned earlier, which is trying to duplicate the regional center context, which is very tricky to do.
It is. And like I said, I think we're seeing a lot of people very quickly try and repackage their projects as direct by simply saying, hey, now we're going to count direct jobs instead of using an indirect and induced job creation model. And the reality of the situation is that that's just one aspect of how the two programs differ.
That's
but
right.
It's not a challenging thing if you ask
And
me.
it raises another question too, because in theory, right, the law on participation, I think, between regional center and direct projects is the same. However, as a practical matter, I can think of cases we've had where USCIS have asked, how's this person participating in the business? So I think in a regional center context, because of the way LPs work and different things, it's quite, you get what theoretically nobody can be a passive investor in EB-5, right? But with regional centers, you get as hell as near to being a passive investor as one could ever possibly be. What we see is in a direct context, perhaps not in every case, but in many cases, the question is raised as to how is this person meaningfully participating in the business? Now you can hedge around that and you can create a board, you can put someone on board, there are things that you can do, but I think it's a very real issue. As I see it, it's not, it's a practical difference.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it speaks to what you had said earlier about the additional scrutiny that the USCIS is likely to provide. I do expect that because they're going to see a rush of unique and different structures, that those are the types of things they're going to be questioning. Hey, this is a direct program, this direct project. The investors need to be more involved in the ongoing day-to-day business activities of the project. I do think that whether they're statutorily accurate in their scrutiny, there's going to be additional scrutiny as far as how the investors are participating in the day-to-day policy making of that new business. So I think you're probably right, Mark.
There's a question. We have a business for over 28 years and we are getting ready to retire. We are looking to sell it, and EB-5 is a good opportunity. I guess they mean for the purchaser. What seems to me, I'll let you talk, Matt, but it seems to me the one big problem you bump into there is you've got to create 10 new jobs. But
yeah. Yeah, so two big issues, right? You number one, you can do an EB-5 investment in one of two ways. You can create a new commercial enterprise, and in your case, it's not a new business, it's not a new commercial enterprise. So that doesn't work at all. Or you can infuse capital into a struggling business in an effort to preserve, save, or grow job creation by at least 10 jobs. And there's a lot of nuance involved in that, understanding whether or not the business was failing, understanding whether or not the project will actually be able to sustain and maintain or create 10 new jobs is a challenging task. And then also, not to sugarcoat it, there's a lot of investors that, again, think of their goals. Give me my green card, give me my money back. So if the business truly is a struggling business enterprise and that's the route that they're taking, they've got to be truly concerned with the operations and the mechanics of that business and whether or not it's a feasible investment that will allow them to get their green card and their money back.
Another, these kinds of things come up all the time when someone wants to buy a business. Another thing to be aware of is your money's supposed to create new jobs, right? So let's suppose that Matt sold CMB regional centers to me today for $500,000, apart from the fact the rest of his family would emasculate him for it. But if I give Matt $500,000, that's done nothing to create jobs, right? So I've paid for the business and I've paid $500,000 for the business, but USCIS, no, that's done nothing to create jobs. So be careful of purchase transactions where you're purchasing a business, because that's probably not going to be deemed as an investment for EB-5 purposes, just giving Matt $500,000.
You're exactly right. And so this is something that I think we'll see more of in the direct model. We've actually been approached by different groups that are asking us, okay, well, would you raise direct EB-5 investors to invest into, X business? Okay, well, what is the business? Okay, well, we're going to manufacture, widgets. And okay, well, understand that when we invest into this business, we have to create jobs. And those jobs have to be new American jobs. And the money, we have to be able to show how the money is going to create those jobs. And so maybe you have a factory under development and you're going to have to hire the 10 new people. But the USCIS is actually also going to scrutinize kind of what you use the money for. and how you spent the money. All those things actually do matter in these transactions. And so there also does have to be a clear path between the investment and the job creation. So where that gets blurred with an existing business is how exactly did you use the money? And so
we've always tried to, at least I have, tried to tie the capital expenditure to the actual job creation as tightly as possible. Maybe it's not purely necessary to go to the lengths we've sometimes been to show that, like, for example, a particular machine requires X operators and you're buying the machine. But if you do that, it becomes very difficult for USCIS to turn around and say, sorry, some of those jobs don't qualify. Because if I buy a machine with a capital and it requires X operators, that's pretty thing.
Yeah,
the question is,
if they're already there, if they're already existing, the machines are already there, the workers are already there. Right. And you're just saying I'm adding workers, it gets a little complicated.
So one of the questions is, I gather you're advising against direct investments. No, we're not advising against direct investments at all. So, you know, partly we did this with Matt because CMB currently doesn't offer a direct project. So you're not going to get a salesman on here trying to sell you a direct project. And quite the opposite. The whole purpose of this is to give people, if you will, a checklist of things that you need to think about, big risk factors. And Matt is in a position right now where he does project due diligence for a major regional center. So he's in a very good position. So I think if he's saying things that sound very negative against direct EB-5, that's really not what the purpose is. The purpose is to give you some hot issues to look at, right, Matt?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are a whole lot of resources out there about what you should be looking at in regional center program projects. And I don't know that the same resources are out there for direct projects. I know as a regional center that's looked to say, hey, is it a possibility that we could take on projects in the direct model? Those resources on how to structure those, on how to develop those, they're actually relatively few and far between because there hasn't been many structured at scale, you know, or there hasn't been many, you know, regional center type projects converted to direct opportunities. And so the more we've researched it, the more we've learned, the more opportunities that we've been able to kind of envision. But we're also understanding that investors don't see all of these issues because what a lot of times they're looking for is the pre-packaged investment opportunity that just has everything figured out. And that's generally what you've gotten in a lot of good regional center projects, a lot of the projects that we've offered and a lot of the more established regional centers have offered. But what we're seeing in the market is not that. What we're seeing in the market right now isn't, you know, a kind of everything's figured out, you know, everything will work for you. You just have to sign here and you'll get your green card. That's never been the case with regional center projects. It's definitely not been the case in direct. So I'm not advising against direct. What I'm really trying to do is make it clear to people that they really have to do their due diligence. They have to know who they're getting in bed with. They have to know what the business operations will be, and they have to leave no stone unturned when they're going through these things because there shouldn't be a rush to just get into the program. There should be, you know, in my mind, kind of a more cautious approach to looking at how I could take advantage of this situation, but also understand that the regional center program will come back. And everything I've seen tells me that there's just a different level of risk involved in the direct projects versus the regional center projects. And so if you're a little bit more risk averse, and if you're looking for something that allows you to be a little bit more passive, and you're looking for models that are time tested, then maybe you want to take an even harder look at direct and just wait until the regional center program comes back. So again, it's not advising you against the direct offering. We may eventually have a direct EB-5 offering. So believe me, I'm not trying to crush the direct projects, but it's about making sure that investors know what they're getting into.
I think, Matt, if people email us, you know, I sent a draft letter to our team, a draft bullet point list. We can send it to you. Perhaps if people who are on this call want to email in, we can send them just like a bullet point of things to think about when looking at a direct EB-5.
Yeah, that's easy. Yeah. And understand that if we do come out with a direct project, just as I mentioned, we are looking at opportunities in the direct investment model. If we do, our goal is going to be able to answer all of these questions that we're asking you to ask of other regional centers or other groups. I keep calling them regional centers, but other groups that are trying to structure and avail these direct investment opportunities. We're going to want to make sure that when we put something out there, it can live through all of the scrutiny that you can throw at it, or else why put it out there?
Interesting circumstance, right? This to me actually works quite well for direct cases. You've got, direct EB-5 could be a good way for business operators, I think, to expand their business with the right people. This chap is saying, we have one successful business in a location. Can they open more locations? So I can tell you, I'll let you comment, but as a law firm, we've actually done that. Now Becky's on, I think she did a case with medical testing centers. But so if I have an existing business, I know it works, I've got my model in place, can I use direct EB-5 to expand to more locations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what it comes down to is making sure that however you've structured that original business can either work for the structuring that's going to be required for direct, or you may have to have a little bit of flexibility, because I think how people should be looking at these is looking at them for businesses that are structured to create success for direct EB-5, not just trying to force a square peg into a round hole and say that, hey, I think it'll work for direct EB-5, So, but certainly if you're expanding your business, you're creating a new entity that's probably going to, own that location. Investors can co-invest into that new owner entity, and capital can be used for, whether it's the construction of that new business or build out that's required to hire the staff. Understand that it takes some understanding to structure those appropriately. But the other thing that you have going for you in that situation is that you have a model, right? You have another operating asset to compare it to. And so if you're trying to consider how it'll work from a business standpoint, obviously you have a test case.
I am on an H-1B visa and my spouse is on an F-1. After submitting application to USCIS, can I give up my H-1B visa and apply for change to F-2 while we are waiting for approval of an EB-5 application?
Yeah, Mark, I'll let that's more of an immigration attorney sort of question. I'll let you tackle that one.
Sure. Well, I think we would want to look at the details of that. Whoever that is please email us and we'll give you a separate call for that question, because the question that you're asking raises a number of other questions. Essentially, I would not give up an initial status pending an approval of an EB-5 application, an I-526. That's going to put you in a very difficult situation. But what do you mean by approval of an I-526 application? Do you mean the I-526? Do you mean the I-829? There are also myriad other factors that could come into this. So generally that would be a silly thing to do, but everyone's circumstances is different. So, please reach out, and happy to spend some individual time to make sure you get an appropriate answer. So Matt, I know we wanted to be sort of on the hour. We're about 4 minutes off the hour. So if there are any other questions, please do ask them. And as I said, hold on. Can you help us recruit and organize the process? This is the person who wants to open an additional location. If you mean by recruit investors, that's a different thing. In terms of organizing and structuring the process, we absolutely can do that. We've done that with others and we're happy to do it. If you're talking about recruiting people, recruiting investors, then that's not something as a law firm that we can directly engage in.
Yeah, and what I would tell you from my perspective is that we're looking at opportunities that we think can make sense for direct EB-5. So if you have some basic information or you want to reach out to me or my team, please do so, and we can kind of kick the tires on it, so to speak, to figure out if it's something that might make sense for CMB to be involved with.
Someone's saying, I want to do direct EB-5 as quickly as possible. We haven't filed very many at all, if any, of these pre-packed EB-5. And I'll tell you the reason is because every time I talk to an investor and look at the project, I've never told a client not to invest in a project or invest in a project. That's inappropriate. But I do always come up with issues that we see. And based on issues that we see, very few of our clients have chosen to invest in the current options in the market. So when you say direct as soon as possible, I would just counsel you very strongly to think about the list of factors that Matt's talked about and that we've talked about. Don't rush into a direct EB-5 because it could turn into a nightmare of epic proportions. And if you're in a franchise like we talked about earlier, or other types of commercial agreements that you're required to sign off on, you could be taking on more liability than your initial capital investment. So direct EB-5 can be great. If you want to reach out, please do. We'll help you think about some of the legal issues involved in direct EB-5 by looking at individual projects, but please don't just rush into one as quickly as possible. Can I have a step-by-step process for EB-5 and the specified timelines? Are you happy with that one, Matt?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways in which I think people need to look at the process. And, the process for direct EB-5 and the regional center program is not different in that the first thing that you're going to do after you've gotten comfortable with the attorney that you're going to work with, you've picked the investment opportunity that you want to take on, the first step is actually filing your I-526 petition. After you'd file that I-526 petition, these times vary significantly. And right now it's a little bit different because the regional center program has lapsed. So the USCIS is seeing, much fewer petitions that they will be adjudicating, because right now they're currently not adjudicating any of the pending regional center applications. So in years past, it might have taken maybe, let's say, 24 months for a I-526 petition to get approved. After that point in time, you're actually scheduling your consular interview, and then you're going to be—
Matt, just a question on what you just said. So I see people in the market who are being promised I-526 adjudications in 2 or 3 months if they invest in a direct project. What do you say?
I say that's nuts because they have nothing to base that on. No, it's just a guess. And, no one really knows exactly how long it's going to take for these to get adjudicated, because no one knows what the USCIS is actually doing behind the scenes other than the USCIS. So to say that you're going to get your petition adjudicated in 2 or 3 months, that sounds like a marketing tactic to just push people to file now and hope that they can get ahead of this line of pending petitions that are sitting there. And whether or not that's going to work out for them favorably, who knows?
It reminds me of, we won't mention the project, but there's an expedite project in the market, right, on the regional center side, where they were promising exactly the same thing. And it's no secret that there are people waiting 2 years later.
Yeah, it's one of the things that everyone needs to understand is that the regional centers don't control— I'm sorry, I keep saying the regional centers. I'm so used to my industry, but the issuers, whether they be regional centers or the entity that you're investing with for the direct project, they don't control the processing times. There's only minor things that they can do to speed those things up, and namely that's creating a petition that the USCIS is familiar with and that they've seen many times, and they know where to go back and try and find the information that they need in their adjudication process. And over time, you can develop those. But what I'd tell you, and it goes to what I was talking about with the direct program, there's going to be so many new parties to this program trying to file stuff that looks similar to regional center applications that I think it's going to create a very confusing process to USCIS. You add that to the idea that Mark had mentioned earlier, that there's probably going to be some pretty heavy scrutiny on these petitions right now, especially if they're the only thing that USCIS is adjudicating. To say that something's going to take 2 or 3 months, to me, it seems nuts.
So someone saying that their attorney told them it should take 12 to 15 months. I would say the same thing, hopefully in 12 to 15 months, but nobody knows, right? For someone to tell you that it should be approved in 12 to 15 months, I would say is unethical. And if you complain to a bar association, that person might lose their license to practice law because nobody knows.
Nobody knows. And then also understand that if that 12 or 18 months passes by, there's nothing that your attorney or you can do to speed up that adjudication, because the posted adjudication times are much longer than that. And the only remedy that you have exists after you've waited through the posted adjudication times.
Well, and maybe 2 years. I mean, we were having good luck with writ of mandamus at 2 years. I think once it hits 2 years, maybe there are things you can do, right? Because, judges have pointed out, Matt, that the posted adjudication times is USCIS can post anything they want to, right? They can manipulate the statistics to post anything they want to. So just because USCIS posts a adjudication time, it doesn't mean it's fair and appropriate.
That's right. And, I think what the judges are likely saying in those instances is they're talking about what's reasonable. And they're probably asking USCIS, well, why haven't you been able to adjudicate this? And USCIS doesn't have a great answer as to why they haven't been able to adjudicate it.
But not at 12 to 15 months. So, I would be extremely cautious of anyone who's promising any kind of timeline in this context, because we don't know. The theory that people will give you is what Matt just said, that, hey, we're supposed to be adjudicating, working on all of these regional center cases. We're not working on the regional center cases. So there's more time for the direct cases. But as Matt pointed out, nobody knows what's going on behind the curtain right now there. We don't know how the cases are being allocated, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I saw a question pop up and to get us kind of back on track with the process. So what we're talking about is that adjudication of that 526 petition. And after that has been adjudicated and approved, then you're looking to schedule your consular interview. And at that point in time, you would get your conditional visa to enter the United States. The question that popped up was, once I have that conditional visa, and I call it a conditional visa, but what it is it's a permanent green card. It just has conditions that you met upon the filing of your second application. But once you have that visa, you can live anywhere in the United States. You can work anywhere. At that point in time, you have all the rights of any American citizen, with the exception of the ability to vote, the ability to hold that U.S. passport. You're a green card holder at that point in time. Now, during that period, you do have to establish residency in the United States, and you have to meet the conditions of your green card, or the conditions that have been applied to that green card, which are the creation of the 10 jobs and the sustainment of your investment over that 2-year duration. And at the end of that period, the end of that 2-year period is when you would file your I-829 petition. That petition allows, once that petition is approved, all conditions are removed from your green card. But at the time in which you file that 829 petition, that's when you get into that era in which you're now eligible or able to get the return of your capital if the business of your investment has been successful. And yeah, that really kind of is a very quick summary, but really kind of completes that process. Your 829 is filed. Now that adjudication timeline can also take a while. We've seen it take 2 years, 3 years, but really your conditional green card just keeps getting renewed until it gets adjudicated. So it really has little bearing on you at that point in time. But once that petition is approved, you have a permanent green card.
So a question here is, the application process is long, the I-526 processing, and then the conditional green card. Does one have to employ 10 people for the entire duration? Well, depends what you mean by the entire duration, but the answer to that question is yes and no. And let me tell you why yes and no in a direct context. Because the law says that the 10 jobs must be created within 2 years plus a reasonable time, right, from the green card approval. However, as a practical matter, as we talked about earlier, USCIS will not approve your I-526 unless they are totally and utterly convinced that the jobs will be created. So I've always thought in a direct case, the easiest way is to create the job before you invest, then create the jobs before you file the I-526. Why you might want not to do that right now is we don't know how long the $500,000 window opportunity is going to last, right? That could close very fast. So, so I say it's sort of, there's two answers to this question. Theoretically, right, you got that 2-year window plus a reasonable time from the green card adjudication, however, the I-526 adjudication, green card issuance. However, as a practical matter, unless USCIS are very convinced that those jobs are really going to be created, you won't get the I-526 approval. So the better strategy is to create as many of them before the I-526 adjudication as possible. Matt, what do you think?
I completely agree. And again, that runs parallel to the regional center program as well. If they're going to come back and ask you questions at the I-526 adjudication period and your business has not moved forward in any of the things that you said you were going to do 12 months, 24 months earlier, USCIS is likely going to reject that 526 petition. Again, there's maybe there's arguments as to whether or not they should be able to do that. The I-526 is supposed to be prospective, forward-looking, but if you're kind of proving with action that you're not going to be able to complete the business that you've laid out in your I-526, you're not going to be able to support the evidence required for approval of that I-526 petition. So if you can create those jobs, it's the best thing in the world to be able to respond with any questions to the USCIS and say, hey, business is already up and running here. We've already created X amount of jobs. We'll provide you full details on the I-829 submission in 2 years. That's the best thing to be able to tell them.
Right. So what was this question we just saw here before we wrap up? Can I live anywhere in the US once I get approved?
Yep. And we spoke about that. Once you have that conditional green card, as I mentioned, it's really a permanent green card with conditions. You can live anywhere, you can work anywhere in the United States.
So with that,
that's a really common question. A lot of people that become directly involved in the ownership of a business, in that situation, you're going to want to pick to, if you're the sole entrepreneur and running that business, obviously you're going to want to live where that business is up and running. But if you're a bit more passive or the structure allows you to be remote, the business can operate in California and you can live in Maine all the way across the United States. You can live in Alaska, you can live in Hawaii. It's up to you at that point in time. So,
please, if you want sort of a list of hot things to look at in Direct EB-5, please reach out to Matt or me or any of the team. We'll be happy to provide that to you. If there's any sort of last minute burning questions, please fire them off. But Matt, perhaps, we'll have a list of, sounds like, 10 to 15 things for people to think about. But if you were to think of, in your mind, if you were looking at a Direct EB-5, what the top 3 things would be to look at for people to ask for to going away?
So the top 3 things that I would look at if I was looking at a Direct EB-5, number 1, it's job creation. It's wanting to understand the model, the staffing model that they're going to use, what the business operations of that restaurant will be, and how likely it is that they're going to be able to create and maintain those jobs. And then the second thing I'm looking at, and this seems pretty straightforward, right? The second thing I'm looking at is the overall structure of that business. Who's going to be in control? Who's operating the majority of the day-to-day? Am I, a preferred equity investor? Or am I a common equity investor? What are my rights in that structure? Am I going to have some say in the overall, day-to-day business operations, or am I really just along for the ride? Those are the things that I'm going to want to know. And then the third, like any business investment, you're going to want to know, what are the business projections? What's it going to do? Because I'm going to put $500,000 into something that I own. I have no collateral. And if it fails, I'm probably going to have to infuse more capital in order to get my green card, or I'm going to have to make a decision to walk away from it and likely lose my green card and lose my $500,000. So I'm going to want to understand that it's a truly viable business opportunity.
I'll just try to hit these questions that have been asked. So basically, I have to transfer the money before filing I-526. Yes, but it doesn't necessarily have to go into the business. We can lock it away in an escrow account, so it's earmarked for that purpose and it's drawn down over time. The more of it you spend up front, probably the lower the risk. But so my answer to that question is yes and no. You might not have to transfer the entire amount directly to be deployed into the business. There might be a way to structure that a little differently. But you're going to have to, certainly you would want to segregate the funds that are going to be used for this purpose. Is it necessary to be in and have them in the US? Is it necessary to be in the US once I-526 is approved for the entire family? That's a topic for another call. If you want we can get into that. But please reach out because I know that, Matt, thank you for joining us. I know you have another obligation to rush to, so I don't want to get into too many more questions. But
okay, well, this has been fantastic. Thank you, Mark, for putting this together. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
All right, thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.